The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her gear one final time. After 18 months deployed in Afghanistan, she was finally returning to Fort Bragg for advanced training. The familiar weight of her rifle felt different now, less like a burden and more like an extension of herself. She had left as a nervous recruit fresh out of basic training, but she was returning as something else entirely. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the base, and Sarah watched through the dusty window as groups of new recruits went through their morning drills. Their movements were sharp but uncertain, their faces still soft with the innocence that war had slowly carved away from her own features. She remembered being just like them, eager to prove herself, terrified of failure, and completely unaware of what lay ahead. As the truck came to a stop near the barracks, Sarah gathered her duffel bag and stepped down onto the familiar pavement. The air here smelled different than the desert cleaner, without the constant dust and smoke that had become her normal. A few soldiers walked past, some offering nods of recognition. Word traveled fast on a military base, and her reputation had preceded her return. "Martinez!" A voice called out from across the courtyard. Sarah turned to see Sergeant Collins, her former drill instructor, approaching with his characteristic stern expression. "Welcome back, soldier. You've got quite the reputation preceding you." Sarah straightened instinctively. "Thank you, Sergeant. Good to be back on American soil." Collins studied her face, noting the subtle changes that combat had etched there. "You're assigned to Barracks C, same building but different world now. You'll be working with the Advanced Combat Training Program, sharing your experiences with the new recruits." The word experiences hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah nodded, understanding that her role had shifted from student to teacher, whether she felt ready for it or not. As she made her way to the barracks, Sarah passed the obstacle course where a group of recruits was struggling through their afternoon training. Their instructor was pushing them hard, shouting commands and corrections as they stumbled through the course. She paused for a moment, watching their clumsy but determined efforts, remembering her own first attempts at the same obstacles. "Move it, Richards. My grandmother could crawl faster than that." The instructor's voice carried across the field. "Thompson, what are you doing? That's not how you hold a rifle." Sarah continued walking, but she could feel eyes following her. Whispers started among the recruits who had noticed her. She caught fragments of their conversations as she passed. "Is that her? I heard she just got back from Afghanistan. Someone said she was a sniper." The attention made her uncomfortable. Sarah had never sought the spotlight, and the idea of being the subject of base gossip didn't appeal to her. She quickened her pace toward the barracks, hoping to find some quiet space to settle in and process being back in this environment. Barracks C looked exactly as she remembered it, but stepping inside felt like entering a different world. The soldiers here weren't fresh-faced recruits anymore. These were men and women who had seen combat, who understood the weight of the uniform they wore. Their eyes held the same depth that Sarah now recognized in her own reflection. Her bunk was in the same section where she had slept during her initial training, but now she was surrounded by soldiers who had earned their place through battle rather than basic training scores. The conversations here were different too, less bravado, more substance. They talked about missions, tactics, and the reality of warfare with the kind of understanding that could only come from experience. "You must be Martinez," said a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall woman with short blonde hair and sergeant stripes on her uniform. "I'm Rebecca Torres. I'll be your bunkmate for the duration of your stay here." Sarah shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of confidence earned through trials. "Good to meet you. How long have you been back?" 3 months. Iraq deployment, 15 months. Still getting used to sleeping without the sound of helicopters overhead. Rebecca's smile was understanding rather than bitter. "It takes time to readjust." As they talked, other soldiers in the barracks began to gather around, introducing themselves and sharing their own stories of deployment and return. There was Marcus, who had served 2 tours in Iraq and was now training to become an instructor. Diana, who had been a combat medic and was working on her next assignment. James, who had survived an IED explosion and was slowly working his way back to full duty. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: the difficulty of transition, the weight of memory, and the strange combination of pride and sorrow that came with having served in combat. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time since stepping off the transport, surrounded by people who understood without needing explanations. "So what was your MOS over there?" Marcus asked, using the military acronym for job specialty. "Infantry, but I ended up doing a lot of different things." The situation demanded flexibility. Sarah's answer was deliberately vague. She wasn't ready to talk about the specifics of what she had done, even with people who would understand. Rebecca caught the evasion and nodded knowingly. "We all did what was needed. The important thing is you made it back." As evening approached, the barracks began to settle into the rhythm of military life. Soldiers cleaned their gear, wrote letters home, or simply sat quietly with their thoughts. Sarah found herself at her bunk, unpacking the few personal items she had carried with her throughout her deployment. There was a photo of her family, her parents and younger brother standing in front of their house in Texas. They looked so young and happy, frozen in a moment before war had touched their lives. There was also a small notebook where she had written down thoughts and observations during quiet moments in Afghanistan. The pages were filled with reflections on fear, courage, loss, and survival. As she held the notebook, memories began to surface unbidden. The weight of her rifle as she took her first shot in combat. The sound of helicopters coming in for evacuation after a firefight. The faces of fellow soldiers who hadn't made it home. The impossible decisions that had to be made in split seconds. "You okay?" Rebecca's voice broke through her reverie. Sarah looked up, realizing she had been staring at the notebook for several minutes without moving. "Yeah, just thinking." "The memories come back stronger when you're trying to sleep," Rebecca said softly. "At least for me they did. It gets easier, but it never completely goes away." Sarah nodded, grateful for the understanding. She had been dreading the nighttime, knowing that sleep would bring dreams she wasn't ready to face. "What helped you?" Sarah asked. "Staying busy during the day. Physical training, learning new skills, talking to other people who had been through it. And time. Lots of time." Rebecca sat on her own bunk, facing Sarah. "But also accepting that being changed by what you went through isn't the same as being broken by it." The wisdom in those words resonated deeply with Sarah. She had spent the journey home wondering if she would ever feel normal again, if the person she had been before deployment was gone forever. Rebecca's perspective offered a different way of thinking about the changes she felt within herself. As lights out approached, the barracks grew quiet except for the soft sounds of soldiers settling in for sleep. Sarah lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of a military base at night. Guard rotations changing, the distant hum of generators, the occasional vehicle passing by. For the first time in months, she felt relatively safe. Not the hyper-vigilant safety of a combat zone where every sound could mean danger, but the deeper safety of being surrounded by people who understood her experience and would watch her back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would have to face questions about her deployment, interact with recruits who saw her as either a hero or a curiosity, and begin the process of figuring out what came next in her military career. But tonight, she was just a soldier among soldiers, no different from anyone else trying to find their way back to themselves. As sleep finally began to claim her, Sarah's last conscious thought was of the young recruits she had seen training earlier. Soon, she would be responsible for helping prepare them for what lay ahead. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but it also gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since her return. She would help them understand not just the technical skills they would need, but the emotional and mental preparation that no training manual could fully capture. She would try to give them tools for survival that went beyond weapons and tactics. In her dreams that night, Sarah found herself back in Afghanistan, but this time she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by the faces of the recruits she had seen training, looking to her for guidance and protection. The dream wasn't the nightmare she had expected, but rather a reminder of the continuity between what she had endured and what she might now be able to give back. When morning came, she would begin the next chapter of her service, carrying forward both the scars and the wisdom that her deployment had given her. The alarm clock shattered the relative peace of Sarah's first morning back at Fort Bragg. 5:30 came earlier than she remembered, but her body was already awake, conditioned by months of hypervigilance to rise before dawn. Around her, the other soldiers in the barracks were going through their morning routines with the efficient precision that came from years of military discipline. After a quick shower and breakfast in the mess hall, Sarah reported to the training complex where she would begin her new role as a combat instructor. The building was larger than she remembered, with new additions that spoke of the military's ongoing need to prepare soldiers for the realities of modern warfare. Colonel Patricia Hayes was waiting in the main office, a woman in her mid-40s whose reputation for excellence was legendary throughout the base. She had served in multiple deployments and had transitioned into training with the same intensity she had brought to combat operations. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Hayes said, standing as Sarah entered and saluted. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your commanding officer in Afghanistan sent glowing reports about your performance under pressure." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and discomfort at the praise. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm ready to contribute to the training program in whatever way I can." "Good. Because we have a challenging group of recruits who need someone with your experience to help them understand what they're training for." Colonel Hayes gestured for Sarah to sit. "These aren't fresh-faced kids straight out of high school. Most of them have been through basic training and some specialized courses. They think they know what combat is about." The colonel handed Sarah a file containing profiles of the recruits she would be working with. As she scanned through the pages, she saw a mix of backgrounds and motivations. Some had joined straight from college, others had previous military experience in non-combat roles, and a few were seeking to transition from other branches of the military. "What's the biggest challenge they're facing?" Sarah asked. "Overconfidence mixed with inexperience. They've mastered the technical skills, but they don't understand the psychological and emotional demands of actual combat. That's where you come in." Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair. "Your job is to help them bridge that gap without breaking their confidence entirely." Sarah nodded, understanding the delicate balance required. Too much reality too quickly could overwhelm young soldiers, but too little preparation could get them killed when they faced real combat situations. "You'll start by observing their current training exercises, getting a feel for their capabilities and attitudes. Then, we'll gradually integrate your input into their curriculum." The colonel stood, indicating the meeting was coming to an end. "Remember, Sergeant, your experiences in Afghanistan were unique, but every soldier needs to find their own path through combat. Your role is to guide, not to relive." After leaving the colonel's office, Sarah made her way to Training Field 7, where her assigned group was conducting morning exercises. From a distance, she could see about 20 soldiers working through various scenarios under the supervision of Master Sergeant Davis, a veteran instructor with over 15 years of experience. The recruits were practicing room-clearing techniques, working in teams to navigate through a mock building designed to simulate urban combat environments. Sarah watched as they moved through the structure, noting their communication patterns, weapon handling, and decision-making under pressure. Most of them were technically proficient, she observed. Their movements were sharp, their communication clear, and their weapons handling safe and effective. But there was something missing, the edge that came from knowing that mistakes had real consequences beyond failed exercises and disappointed instructors. "Not bad, but not great either," came a voice beside her. Sarah turned to see Master Sergeant Davis approaching, his eyes still focused on the training exercise. "They've got the skills, but they're still playing at war instead of preparing for it. It's hard to simulate the pressure of real combat," Sarah replied. "The knowledge that lives depend on your decisions changes everything." "Exactly. And that's something we hope you can help them understand." Davis finally looked at her directly. "I've read your file. Your unit saw some serious action over there." Sarah nodded but didn't elaborate. She was still learning how to talk about her experiences without either minimizing them or overwhelming her listeners with details they weren't prepared to hear. As the morning exercise concluded, the recruits began to gather around the field, removing their gear and discussing their performance. Sarah could hear fragments of their conversations, technical critiques, good-natured ribbing about mistakes, and the kind of banter that helped soldiers bond with their unit. "Attention!" Master Sergeant Davis called out, and the recruits immediately fell into formation. "I want to introduce Sergeant Sarah Martinez, who will be joining our training program." Sergeant Martinez recently returned from an 18-month deployment in Afghanistan, where she distinguished herself in combat operations. Sarah felt 20 pairs of eyes focusing on her with varying degrees of curiosity, respect, and challenge. She had been dreading this moment since accepting the assignment, knowing that first impressions would shape everything that followed. "At ease," she said, stepping forward. "I'm not here to tell you war stories or to prove how tough combat is. I'm here to help you prepare for situations you hope you'll never face but need to be ready for anyway." One of the recruits, a young man with the confident posture of someone who had excelled at every military training he had encountered, raised his hand. "Sergeant, we've all been through extensive combat training. What can you teach us that we haven't already learned?" The question was asked respectfully, but Sarah could hear the underlying challenge. This was a test, both of her authority and of whether she had anything valuable to offer soldiers who already considered themselves well prepared. "That's a fair question," Sarah replied, appreciating the directness. "Technical skills are just the foundation. The real challenges of combat are psychological, emotional, and moral. You can master every weapon system and tactical procedure, but until you understand how fear, adrenaline, and split-second life-or-death decisions affect your thinking, you're only partially prepared." Another recruit, a woman about Sarah's age with short red hair and intense green eyes, spoke up. "How do we prepare for something we can't really simulate?" "Good question. We can't perfectly simulate combat, but we can help you understand your own responses to stress, fear, and uncertainty. We can teach you to recognize when your training is being overwhelmed by emotion, and how to get back to your foundation when everything around you is chaos." For the next hour, Sarah worked with the recruits on a modified version of the room-clearing exercise they had been practicing. But, instead of focusing on technical execution, she introduced elements of uncertainty and psychological pressure designed to test their mental resilience. She had them execute the same scenarios while being bombarded with loud noises, unexpected obstacles, and constantly changing objectives. She watched as their perfect technical execution began to break down under pressure, as communication became strained and decision-making became hesitant. "Stop," Sarah called out after the third iteration of the exercise. The recruits gathered around her, breathing hard and looking frustrated with their performance. "What happened in there?" she asked. "We couldn't hear each other over the noise," one recruit complained. "The objectives kept changing before we could complete them," said another. "It felt chaotic and impossible to stay organized," added a third. "Exactly," Sarah said. "Now imagine that the noise isn't just simulated sound effects, but actual gunfire and explosions. Imagine that the changing objectives are because your mission just went completely wrong and people are dying while you try to figure out what to do next." The group fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Combat isn't a controlled environment where you get to practice the same scenarios until you perfect them. It's chaos, confusion, and terror mixed together with moments of clarity where your training has to take over. Sarah looked around at their faces, seeing the beginning of real understanding. "Your technical skills are excellent, but you need to learn how to access those skills when your mind is screaming and your hands are shaking." Over the following days, Sarah gradually introduced more psychological elements into their training. She taught them breathing techniques for managing fear, communication strategies for chaotic environments, and decision-making frameworks for situations where all options were bad. But, more importantly, she began to share carefully chosen stories from her deployment, not the dramatic action sequences that movies focused on, but the quiet moments of terror, the impossible moral choices, and the weight of responsibility that came with knowing that other people's lives depended on your decisions. The recruits began to respond differently to her instruction. The initial skepticism gave way to genuine respect as they realized that her experiences gave her insights that no training manual could provide. They started asking more thoughtful questions, not about technical procedures but about the mental and emotional challenges of combat. "How do you deal with making decisions when people die no matter what you choose?" asked Jennifer, the red-haired recruit who had asked the first serious question. Sarah paused before answering, remembering specific moments from her deployment when she had faced exactly that situation. "You accept that perfect solutions don't exist in combat. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, take responsibility for the consequences, and keep moving forward. The alternative is paralysis, which usually makes everything worse." "What about afterward?" asked Marcus, another recruit who had been particularly engaged with the psychological aspects of training. "How do you live with the weight of those decisions? You remember that the people you saved matter as much as the people you couldn't save. You honor the dead by learning from every experience and using that knowledge to save more lives in the future." Sarah's voice carried the weight of personal experience. "And you accept that carrying that weight is part of the price of being responsible for other people's safety." As the weeks progressed, Sarah found herself becoming more comfortable with her role as instructor. The recruits were responding well to her teaching methods, showing improvement not just in technical skills but in mental resilience and emotional preparation. But she also realized that teaching them was helping her process her own experiences in ways she hadn't expected. Articulating the lessons she had learned in combat forced her to examine and understand her own journey through trauma and survival. The nightmares that had plagued her since returning from deployment began to change. Instead of being trapped in memories of violence and loss, she began to dream about teaching and guiding, about helping others avoid the mistakes she had seen cost lives in Afghanistan. Her role was evolving from survivor to teacher, and, in that evolution, she was finding a new sense of purpose that helped balance the weight of everything she had experienced overseas. 3 weeks into her training assignment, Sarah was walking across the base after a particularly intense session with her recruits when she heard voices coming from the main gate area. It was late afternoon, and a new group of soldiers was arriving for training. She could hear the nervous energy in their conversations, the mixture of excitement and apprehension that she remembered from her own arrival at the base years ago. As she approached, she could see about 15 new recruits gathering their gear and getting their first orientation from the gate guards. They looked impossibly young to her now, their uniforms still crisp and their faces unmarked by the experiences that would soon reshape them. "This is it," one of them was saying to his companions. "Real military training with combat veterans. I heard some of the instructors here have actually been in firefights," said another, a young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun. "My brother told me they have people who've killed enemy combatants," added a third recruit, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and nervous excitement. Sarah slowed her pace, remembering her own similar conversations when she had first arrived. The idea of meeting someone who had actually been in combat had seemed both thrilling and terrifying to her younger self. Now, from the other side of that divide, she understood how naive those early expectations had been. As the new group was being processed through the gate, one of them noticed Sarah walking by. Her combat patch from her Afghanistan deployment was clearly visible on her uniform, and word had apparently spread about her presence on the base. "Hey," called out one of the new arrivals, a tall young man with the kind of confidence that came from excelling in basic training. "Are you one of the combat veterans who teaches here?" Sarah paused, considering how to respond. She could simply confirm her status and continue walking, but something in the recruit's tone and the expectant faces around him made her decide to engage. "I'm Sergeant Martinez. I work with the Advanced Combat Training Program." "Cool." The same recruit stepped forward, his enthusiasm evident. "So you've been deployed? Seen real action?" Sarah nodded, uncomfortable with the excitement in his voice. "I served in Afghanistan for 18 months. The group of new recruits began to gather around her, their curiosity overcoming their nervousness about approaching a non-commissioned officer. Sarah found herself surrounded by eager young faces, all looking at her as if she represented something heroic and exciting. "What was it like?" asked the blonde woman who had spoken earlier. "Were you in firefights?" asked another. "Did you ever have to?" The tall recruit hesitated, then pressed forward with his question. "How many kills do you have?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Of all the questions she had expected, this one caught her completely off guard. The casual way it was asked, as if enemy deaths were sports statistics to be compared and celebrated, made her stomach turn. The group fell silent, waiting for her answer. Sarah could see the anticipation in their faces, the expectation that she would share some exciting number that would validate their romantic notions about combat and heroism. For a moment, Sarah was transported back to Afghanistan. She could see the faces of the people whose lives she had taken in the line of duty, not numbers or enemy combatants, but human beings with families, hopes, and fears. She remembered the weight of each decision, the sleepless nights that followed, and the knowledge that taking a life, even in legitimate defense, left scars on the soul that never fully healed. Kills, she repeated softly, her voice barely audible. The word felt foreign and wrong in her mouth. Yeah, the tall recruit pressed, apparently not noticing her change in demeanor. I mean, you were in combat for 18 months. You must have some confirmed kills, right? Sarah looked around at the young faces surrounding her, seeing her younger self reflected in their eagerness and naivety. She realized that this moment would shape how they thought about combat, violence, and what it meant to be a soldier. Her answer could either feed their dangerous romanticism or help them understand the reality they were preparing to face. Every person whose life I took in Afghanistan had a name, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the group with unexpected intensity. They had families who loved them, children who waited for them to come home, and dreams they'll never fulfill because of decisions I had to make in split seconds. The enthusiasm drained from the recruits' faces as they processed her words. The tall recruit who had asked the original question looked confused, as if her response wasn't what he had expected from a combat veteran. I don't keep count of kills because they weren't kills. They were human beings whose deaths will stay with me for the rest of my life. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. Every shot I fired in combat was necessary to protect my fellow soldiers and complete our mission, but that necessity doesn't make those deaths something to celebrate or count like trophies. The group stood in uncomfortable silence, clearly unprepared for this perspective on combat. Sarah could see them struggling to reconcile her words with their preconceptions about what a combat veteran should be like. But, you're a hero, right? Asked a younger recruit who couldn't have been more than 19. You saved lives and defeated the enemy. Sarah studied his earnest face, seeing the desperate need for heroes and clear moral victories that had driven her own enlistment years earlier. I did my job, she said simply. Sometimes the job required taking lives to save lives. Sometimes it meant making impossible choices in situations where any decision would result in people dying. That doesn't make me a hero or a villain. It makes me a soldier who did what was necessary in an imperfect world. The blonde recruit spoke up hesitantly. How do you deal with having to kill people? You remember that every life has value, including the lives of enemy combatants. You take no pleasure in violence, even when it's necessary. You carry the weight of those decisions because that weight reminds you of your humanity. Sarah paused, considering her next words carefully. And you honor the dead by learning from every experience and using that knowledge to protect more lives in the future. One of the gate guards, who had been listening to the conversation, stepped forward. All right, recruits, let's get you processed and to your barracks. Sergeant Martinez has other duties to attend to. As the group began to disperse, the tall recruit who had asked the original question approached Sarah hesitantly. Sergeant, I'm sorry if my question was inappropriate. I didn't mean to. I just thought. You thought combat was like a video game where enemy deaths are points to be scored, Sarah said, not unkindly. Most people who haven't been in combat think that way. It's not your fault for not understanding something you haven't experienced. Will you be one of our instructors? He asked. Possibly. If I am, the first thing I'll teach you is that every aspect of combat training is about preserving life, your fellow soldiers' lives, and, when possible, even the lives of enemy combatants. The goal is never to kill. The goal is to complete the mission and bring everyone home safely. As the recruit walked away to rejoin his group, Sarah remained standing near the gate, processing what had just happened. The question about kills had forced her to confront her own relationship with the violence she had experienced in Afghanistan, and her response had surprised even her with its intensity. She realized that somewhere in the process of becoming an instructor, she had developed a clear understanding of how she wanted to present combat to new soldiers. Not as a glamorous adventure or a chance for heroic glory, but as a serious responsibility that required mental, emotional, and moral preparation as much as physical and technical training. Walking back toward the training complex, Sarah thought about the faces of the new recruits and how they had changed during their brief conversation. She had shattered some of their illusions about combat, which felt cruel but necessary. Better for them to understand the reality now, during training, than to learn it the hard way in actual combat situations. That evening, she found herself in the barracks talking with Rebecca and some of the other veteran soldiers about the encounter. "They asked you for a body count?" Rebecca shook her head in disgust. "I hate that question. As if war is a competition where whoever kills the most people wins." "The movies and video games don't help," added Marcus, who was sitting nearby cleaning his rifle. "They make it look exciting and heroic instead of showing what it actually costs." "What did you tell them?" asked Diana. Sarah recounted her response, and the group nodded approvingly. "Good," said Rebecca. "They need to understand that taking a life changes you, even when it's necessary. Even when it's the right thing to do." "The hardest part about coming back," Marcus added, "is dealing with people who want to treat you like some kind of action movie character. They want the exciting stories, but they don't want to hear about the nightmares, the guilt, or the weight you carry." Sarah realized that her response to the recruits had been as much for her own benefit as for theirs. By articulating her feelings about the lives she had taken, she had helped herself process the complex emotions surrounding her combat experiences. "Do you think I was too harsh with them?" she asked the group. "No," Diana said firmly. "They're about to start training for situations where people's lives will depend on their decisions. They need to understand the weight of that responsibility from the beginning." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the young recruit who had asked the original question. She wondered if her words had made an impact on his understanding of what military service really meant, or if he would simply dismiss her perspective as overly serious. She hoped that when he faced his first real combat situation, he would remember her words about the value of human life and the weight of necessary violence. She hoped that all of the recruits she worked with would carry that understanding with them, not as a burden that would paralyze them, but as a foundation that would help them make better decisions under pressure. The next morning, Sarah was assigned to work with the new group of recruits as they began their orientation training. As she walked onto the training field, she saw the same young faces from the gate encounter, now dressed in training gear and ready for their first official instruction. The tall recruit who had asked about kills caught her eye and nodded respectfully. She could see in his expression that their conversation had made an impression on him, though she couldn't tell yet whether it was the kind of impact she had hoped for. "Good morning," she said to the assembled group. "Yesterday some of you asked me about my combat experience. Today we're going to begin learning about what combat really involves, not the Hollywood version, but the reality of making life or death decisions under pressure while maintaining your humanity and moral compass." As she began their first lesson, Sarah realized that teaching these recruits was helping her continue to process and understand her own experiences. Each question they asked forced her to examine her memories from new angles, and each lesson she taught helped her integrate her combat experiences into a broader understanding of service and responsibility. 2 months had passed since Sarah's arrival at Fort Bragg, and her role as a combat instructor had evolved beyond what she had initially expected. The recruits she worked with had developed a deep respect for her teaching methods, which focused on psychological preparation and moral grounding as much as tactical skills. Word of her approach had spread throughout the base, leading to requests for her to work with additional groups and speak at training seminars. On this particular morning, Sarah was preparing for a specialized session with a group of recruits who were destined for deployment in high-risk areas. These soldiers had already completed basic combat training and were now receiving advanced preparation for the specific challenges they would face overseas. Among this group was David Shen, the tall recruit who had asked her about kills during that first encounter at the gate. Over the past weeks, Sarah had watched him transform from someone who viewed combat as an exciting adventure into a soldier who understood the serious responsibilities that came with carrying a weapon in defense of others. Today we're going to discuss something that no training manual covers adequately, Sarah began, addressing the group of 20 soldiers assembled in the classroom. We're going to talk about the moment when everything you've trained for becomes real, and how to maintain your decision-making capabilities when your mind is telling you to panic. She walked to the front of the classroom, where a detailed map of a Middle Eastern city was displayed on the wall. This is a recreation of a situation I encountered during my second month in Afghanistan. Your patrol is moving through an urban area when you receive reports of enemy activity in the vicinity. You have civilians in the area, limited visibility, and intelligence that may or may not be accurate. Sarah pointed to various locations on the map. Your mission is to investigate the reports without endangering civilians or exposing your team to unnecessary risk. But, as you move through the area, the situation begins to deteriorate rapidly. She began to describe the scenario in detail, drawing from her actual experiences but modifying them for training purposes. The recruits listened intently as she outlined the complex web of factors that had to be considered in real time during combat operations. You're moving through this alley when you hear gunfire from the direction of your planned route. Your radio operator reports that another patrol in the area has made contact with enemy forces. Your squad leader is asking for your assessment of whether to continue with the original mission or provide support to the engaged patrol. Jennifer, the red-haired recruit who had consistently asked thoughtful questions during training, raised her hand. How do you make that decision with so many unknown variables? That's exactly the right question, Sarah replied. In training, we practice scenarios where we have clear objectives and relatively complete information. In real combat, you're constantly making decisions with incomplete information while under extreme stress. She moved to the whiteboard and began writing down the factors that had to be considered in the scenario. You have to weigh the importance of your original mission against the immediate need to support fellow soldiers under fire. You have to consider the capabilities of your team, the terrain you'll be moving through, and the potential consequences of each possible decision. David raised his hand. How do you keep from being paralyzed by all those considerations? It seems like there's too much to think about in the time you have to make the decision. Sarah smiled, recognizing the growth in his thinking since their first encounter. That's where your training becomes crucial, but not just your technical training. The psychological preparation we've been working on teaches you to recognize when you're beginning to feel overwhelmed and how to focus on the most critical factors. She walked back to the map and traced the route her patrol had actually taken during the real incident. In this situation, my team decided to alter our route to provide overwatch for the engaged patrol while still maintaining our ability to complete our original mission. It wasn't a